Welcome to another episode of Catalyzing Radical Systemic Change, where it's all about discovering, mapping, and cross-pollinating what I think are the various building blocks towards a planetary civilization ahead. Today's topic is trauma healing and neuro-balancing. So before we start diving deep into the topic, I want to sketch from my personal background why I really think this topic is so important. So first of all, yes, I had a traumatizing childhood experience, and I know also my dear friend, actually one of my closest and oldest friends in the room together, in between Guatemala and Switzerland, Johannes Eisenburger, a trained trauma therapist, and specifically working with neuro-balancing. We will sketch our own biographical pivotal moments that connected us to this important topic. And why do I think this is important, especially from a world-centric perspective? We're recording this podcast whilst there's civic unrest in Guatemala. And just yesterday, there was a war declaration in Israel. And when we look throughout the history of humanity, it seems individually as well as collectively, we're just stacking multiple traumas on top of each other. And the question is really, how can we untie that? How can we heal us individually and maybe also collectively to really, sketch, design a planetary civilization in, peace, abundance, and harmony with us as the stewards, as the dominant species on this planet. So with these introductory words, it's my great pleasure, Johannes, to be in this virtual room together with you for this precious moments to record this podcast. And like always in the podcast, before we dive deeper into the topic, define what trauma is, what is the work that you're doing, how that relates to neurobalancing, I wonder if we go through your biography, because I know there have been some intense pivotal moments, that connected you to the topic, like just sketch the people that are listening in or maybe also watching on YouTube. Who are you? And what were these pivotal moments in your biography that connected you to the topic?
The most difficult question right at the beginning. Who am I? It's a big question I'm on the quest of answering. Well, my name is Johannes, as you said. I think the three-dimensional biography is easiest. That I used to be a trained professional actor in my 20s. And I left the film and theater industry around my 30s when I had a bit of a, let's say, identity crisis. There was also the time when I got into the plant medicine world and was seeking for more. So at the time already, I felt strongly what is now today my slogan, there is more in you. So I felt there's more in me than that, even though I loved acting and I loved being an artist. But today, looking back 10 years later, I have come to realize that my path and my purpose is around the topic of, let's say, the healing arts, a bit more than the performing arts. And so that's what I am on paper. Who I am as a human being is, I think, constantly evolving, constantly changing. I am by birth an Austrian citizen living in Switzerland at the moment. I have a wonderful, extremely old dog who's a miracle and has been with me for 15 years. And I'm a consciousness explorer and many more things. But by definition, I would say I'm a somatic executive coach. I work with leaders, entrepreneurs, high achievers on helping them resolve the blocks that are in their way of tapping into their innate potential and expressing who they truly are in their form of what they do and bring in the world.
What I found very interesting when you say you work with high achievers and leaders and executives, you were mentioning the word like the innate potential. And when I look in my own biography, my coping mechanisms, and my healing journey, I would say since the breakthrough that I often coin, the breakthrough in my trauma therapy, funnily enough, with when one of the teachers that we share in common 6 years ago, I have the feeling that finally, which is, I mean, I'm 44 now, so we're back in time. I'm 37. I have this breakthrough in trauma therapy. And as suddenly, on a very somatic level, I realize everything that I did in terms of coping mechanisms to not tap into my innate potential. So I wonder when you link that back to your biography, because I want to start at least this maybe first, 5 minutes, like really
Yeah.
sensing into your own
Yeah.
biography. Like, what were the moments where you maybe had a traumatizing experience? What were your ways to like cope with that intense endeavor? And then also sketch some of your own healing journey before we come more into the, let's say, the
Right.
grammar of trauma healing.
Yeah. So to explain that, it's a bit of a question. To explain that, I would like to differentiate already, even though we skip that for later, the difference between shock trauma and developmental trauma. So shock trauma being a singular moment, what most people actually know as trauma. So let's say a car accident or some war or something that was one event that you can work with fairly easily as a therapist, actually, as opposed to developmental trauma. So things that have been happened to you or that you've experienced repeatedly over time. So growing up in a dysfunctional family household, for example, or things like this. Doesn't even have to be childhood abuse, so that stuff, the really nasty stuff. But so one thing that has defined me most, which I come to understand today, and I've had a lot of shock trauma. I had a very severe accident with a near-death experience. I've been part of the biggest German aviation catastrophe where I was a firefighter and there was 150 or 100 dead people, 50 of them children. And a few other singular moments that were losing my best friends, for example, within 1 week, unrelated for each other. So boom, like one shock moment that catapults you out of life. The one thing that has defined me most, and I'm still learning about it, and I've had profound insights recently, is the following. So I have come to realize that the way I grew up, and I grew up in a loving household with a big family that loved me and so on and so forth, and materially very well off, was a very spoiled kid, spoiled little prince, you might almost say. But what I've seen and realized lately is that with this, and this happens to many people, comes almost a price tag. So for me, in my personal situation, being the youngest of 5 children and the long-awaited son and everything, it was always a lot about me. There was a lot of attention about me, maybe a lot of expectation, one not particular, but a subtle expectation. So there was a lot about me. But what I've learned, and this is not to blame anyone of my family or my parents, it was never really about me. So you know what I mean? It was about the picture and the projection and the hopes and the wishes that maybe my family had for me, according to their own stories. As like very often we are, for example, a mother's replacement of a partner if the father's never there, or a mother's purpose if she has, like otherwise might be a little bit lonely or lost in life. And I have learned that subconsciously these expectations have led me to a very interesting mechanism. And that is that I have become extremely good, like very, very precise in understanding in any given situation, in any contact with a person, how do I have to be here in order to be seen and loved? So that makes me, I made it my profession as an actor as well to play roles, but I could really see clearly, looking back, how as a child I would adapt to how I thought my mother would like to see me so that I'm loved, how I thought my father would like to see me, how I'd like my sisters or whoever else. And the big problem with that is you become really good at knowing how you have to be, or how you have to act in order to be loved and seen or validated, but you have absolutely no idea how to be authentic. So as you, as my friend, know very well, this has been my one of my biggest struggles in the last, let's say, whatever, 10 years, is I'm like, who am I? That's why it was so hard for me to answer the question. Who am I? Because I've never learned to be authentic. I have always played a role. And that is developmental trauma. This is a coping mechanism, you see? And even without there was any like, I was not beaten as a child. I was, like I had a loving childhood, but still, this is profound. And that's what I would say is what has shaped me as the person who I am most in terms of mental and spiritual and psychological coping mechanisms.
What I find very interesting is that in your biography, you both hold like the two extremes of the spectrum of what you coined, the first definition of trauma, or like sub-segment them, like a shock trauma, which I also had as a child, maybe not as intense as you. I was like severely burning myself very early in my childhood. And let's maybe stay on this biographical realm for a moment before we go into the healing journey, because only after my very, very first, not even psychedelic intervention, but like a intervention with MDMA, I was 32. And the trained therapist was asking me the question, like, how did you feel as a child before burning yourself? And since I had that accident when I was 2 years and 8 months old, I had no bloody idea, because this is before you have like a structured sense of yourself. This basically the birthing of a healthy ego. And what I came to realize is I was very anxious, very afraid. I was not even daring to do many things that other boys were doing, like crazy adventures and stuff like that, but all subconsciously, because obviously I felt pretty like, bold and daring. But since I did hurt myself, so I was like a boiling hot coffee machine was falling over, and I was burning myself that early in my childhood. And only in this one specific intervention in my early 30s, becoming aware that I did basically everything to not hurt myself, which had a lot to do with, in my biography, then mainly the coping mechanism of alcohol and marijuana, to basically lower my frequency, to like drowse myself down to a level where I had the feeling I can go with the rest of the bunch and not like live my full potential. So can we stay for a moment with the shock trauma, and maybe sketching a little bit what happened to you without diving into the details, because I know your shock trauma has been way more intense than mine, and further nuance and differentiate how a shock trauma is different to a developmental trauma that you were just sketching.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, in general theory, as I said, shock trauma is a singular event. And developmental trauma, so shock trauma could, for example, induce PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. With developmental trauma, it's more complex. So the term for it would actually be complex post-traumatic stress disorder. It's really because, as I said, with that story, it is a more complex phenomenon that creates layers of adaptation and coping mechanisms that at some point form our personality. As you surely know from the work that we do with our teacher, the various layers that you have to go through in order to return back to your essence, and you have to travel through the rebellion and the adaptation and the fear and this and all those layers that we have around us. And that is all part of the developmental trauma, or the attachment trauma even, which is still a kind of a different dynamic. And that makes it way more complex to work with. Whereas shock trauma, you have one situation, and on, let's say, a timeline where we say T0 would be the actual event, the traumatic event. And then we have from T -1, -2, -3, -4, -5, up to 8, everything that the body does in order to fight, flight, everything to do in order to survive. And we can extrapolate that, and in therapy, work with that in order to narrow down the time towards the actual event and almost renegotiate or relive or even change the narrative of the story, so that the body, for example, I'm giving a blatant, like, let's say you had a car accident, somebody crashed in behind you, and in these milliseconds, so much stuff happens. So, for example, you're driving, and in the last second, your eyes go up to the rearview mirror, and you see, like, and everything tenses together, and you think, and suddenly, all that stuff. In trauma therapy, in somatic trauma therapy, you would work with these mini movements, for example, looking up and tensing together, and then stopping the story there, and then working with this, what the body has not been able to fully resolve. You've resolved that in the here and now. That kind of heals the trauma in a way. So you are accessing, basically, there's the event, and you take it out, like you enlarge it as if you were to zoom in, and you go almost millisecond by millisecond, and you allow the body to renegotiate and relive the experience, so that it's then, rounded off, and it can let go of it, and all the stress and all the patterns and all the flashbacks and everything that comes with it basically then is done. It's out of the system, and the thing is done, basically. It's a little bit simplified explanation, but yeah.
What I find very interesting already at the beginning of the podcast is, first of all, it seems to be a pretty complex topic. There's a lot of theory and a lot of healing modalities about it. I want to stay still with the differentiation between developmental trauma and shock trauma, because I find it, I know I could also play the educated one, but you're way more trained and educated than myself. I find it somewhat counterintuitive, because when you were sketching your biography, a loving family, the expectations of the mother, just sketching that roughly as the developmental trauma, so that you were more living towards the expectation of others and playing a role than truly being authentic to yourself, and sketching that as developmental trauma. I find it very counterintuitive, at least towards the beginning of this podcast. Why is this more complex to work with than like a heavy car accident?
Because, in my personal opinion, so I find it more fascinating to work with. That's the thing. I find it fascinating to work with for some reason, but this might be, maybe also professional deformation. A bit easier to work with shock trauma, because, as I said, it's a multi-layered thing. There's so many facets related to it, as in this coping mechanism. And often things happen, as you said, with your accident, or often things happen early on when we consciously cannot remember, because the hippocampus in our brain is for memory is not yet fully developed. So if, for example, things happen to us or in the family within our first 3 years, the parents get divorced, somebody dies in the family, something happens to somebody, like there's extreme distress, a single mom that has to work 2 jobs and is slightly depressed and tries her best to do all these things, you cannot consciously remember if that happened in your 3 years, simply because your brain can't, but your body can. And because of these events, that in this time, when we are in these first 3 years, when we are still basically like, we're not finished neurologically, we're like physiologically, neurophysiologically, we're a premature birth as Homo sapiens. So we're not finished, and technically in these first 3 years we would need safety as much as in our mother's womb. Now, who has that, really? So attachment trauma usually happens in these early things. And as I said, with developmental trauma, because it induces a layer of different coping mechanisms and survival strategies that at some point become our personality, and they become so ingrained in us that we can't even see that it's a mechanism, but it's just our reality. That makes it much more complex, as opposed to when you come to me and say, listen, 3 years or 2 years ago, I've had this and that event, and ever since I have nightmares, and I'm like, I'm irrational, and I have flashbacks, and I can't sleep, and it started when I had this incident, then I know exactly what we work with. You see, does this make sense? And there's something very fascinating to say about how those two then are interrelated. Why somebody who has, for example, suffered early trauma, maybe even pre-peri or postnatal trauma, right? Something happened, like like me, for example, you could have been an emergency C-section. This can induce something that we call GHIA, global intensive activation, a global high intensive activation. And that puts the whole system in a form of stress from so early on that this system doesn't know it differently. So it's these type of people, will be including myself, who run through life with an energy that's like. So when you're young, it's still like, oh wow, this guy has so much power, so much energy, you know, like such a can-do, such a go-getter. But at some point, you bet, this constant level of activation in the system, which is of course related to the hormones and adrenaline and cortisol, gets too much. And then we fall into depression, or we get sick, or whatever. And just to finish this off, when you start off life with these form of, let's say, I don't want to call it disorders, with these form of, let's say, imprints, with these form of experiences that your system has made, which are actually changes in the brain. For example, certain areas in the brain might be larger or smaller. The amygdala, for example, might be enlarged. Other areas, it's literally brain function, detrimental brain function in certain areas that are connected or not so good connected in the brain. That later on induces a capacity, let's say a capacity or potential of experiencing more trauma. So there is a reason that can be scientifically explained why, for example, there are people who constantly have their wallet stolen, or who constantly have car accidents, or constantly the same shit happens to them. And they think like, why does this always happen to me? Well, there's a very clear explanation. Because of early traumatization, certain mechanisms that would guide somebody who does not have it into almost like the sense of like warning that we have of not getting into a certain situation, or of being more cautious, that just doesn't work anymore. So the car crashes into them more often, or they attract more often the perpetrator and become a victim. That's a fascinating thing. So there is, you know, sometimes we try to find a spiritual explanation for this. Oh, my soul has chosen the path of always being in car accidents. No, it's actually the brain that lacks certain structures and has a potential for attracting more drama and trauma.
I want to stay with that. So I'm reshuffling in split screen window the bullet points. So there's almost a meme culturally where we say, for example, there's this meme that, you know, people that get abused, for example, physically as children, also attract partners that physically abuse them. And I very much like your notion to not over spiritualize that to some karmic realms and angelical or demonic beings, but really say maybe this actually has to do with how the hormones in your brain and certain functions in your brain develop. So I wonder, can you sketch, without mentioning names, some stories of clients or friends or yourself, how these traumatizing effects early in childhood and in the development of a brain lead towards us choosing pathways to re-traumatize ourselves?
So, for example, I mean, this is a bit of a complex topic because it has to do with attachment, right? But let's just stick with attachment trauma for now. So why does attachment trauma happen? For example, it could be through a breach early on because the mother wasn't present or something. But let's just assume sexual abuse has happened to, let's say, a woman. And of course, there's a generalization and every story is slightly different. And this leaves this woman, and as I see sometimes, with specific behaviors and coping mechanisms and complex patterns of guilt and shame in them. And so they walk through life, and sometimes, they have completely dissociated what had happened to them and forgot about it. But if, for example, somebody with an avoidant, I think I'm going off the track because you asked me, why do people get into trauma again, as in getting the same relationship patterns? So let me park that for now. Simply put, the perpetrator can smell the victim, right? And again, of course, this is archetypal, and of course, we can see it from, let's say, a shamanic or spiritual view, but we can also see it from another view, that if the victim, somebody who has stored in them feelings of like, I can't trust anybody, I have to be careful, nobody's, I might be attacked at any time. So this is a specific trauma category called unavoidable attack. This does something to them in how they would walk through the world. Sometimes if you look closely, you can see it in their physiognomy, like you see it in their body. They would be very cautious, looking around. And these things, if there's somebody who has the energy of a perpetrator, is easy. You get attacked. You like almost like it gets pulled to each other. So once these elements of guilt and shame and all of that is let's say healed, and the person walks through life differently, let's say with more confidence and boundaries. By the way, boundaries are a very, very important topic here, because trauma always breaches boundaries. Trauma is always a breach to the connection to the here and now. It's a breach to the connection to the body, and it breaches our boundaries. So if we don't have boundaries, other people can walk right through them. If you have strong boundaries, it's more difficult for somebody else to attack them. You see what I mean? Does it make sense?
It totally makes sense. I have the feeling it's a good moment within this like very open conversation where you already brought in some nuances that people, who are maybe for the first time, or they heard a little bit about it, or, they read some articles. There seem to be different typologies of trauma. And also it seems, because of our programming, we re-attract situations, partners, business situations in our life that like re-traumatize ourselves. I wonder if you could sketch and then give some examples of the drama triangle, because that's one of the most commonly used frameworks that's, I think, pretty easy to explain and sketch, even if it's a little bit like out of a children's book, really like just sketch the people, maybe if they're caught up in some drama triangles.
Yeah. So, has, let's say, an avoidant attachment style. So they've learned that, wow, people always, they get too close to me. There's a fear of intimacy. So the energy would be a little bit like this. And there's people with an anxious attachment style who are like, I need to be very safe. I need to be close. Now, what's funny and crazy is that these two usually attract each other. Why? Because each of their convictions, each of their understandings of how relationship works is confirmed by the other. So if the anxious person always thinks like, yeah, relationship means like I can never be sure, and I always have to be on my toes, and I'm, the people never want closeness, or like I always have to be like, can never be sure where I am. Of course, the avoidant person justifies that, like it confirms it. Vice versa for the avoidant, like they always attract these people like, fuck, it's always like they come too close, and I'd rather have an open relationship, or like polyamorous and not too much commitment, for example. And it confirms their conviction. So this is kind of how, funny enough, our trauma or attachment styles then bring about exactly the same experiences. So like, for example, when then I would be such a case, and many of my clients, so let's say they're in the mid-30s, and they're like, I think there's a pattern here, and maybe I'm the common denominator. And then and then, because like it's easy in your 20s to say like, those idiots, and girls are all the same, or guys are all the same. But at some point, the good thing about being older, you realize, that might be me. And that's when the journey can begin. Remind me of your other question about, because this is about relationships.
Yeah, I wonder, I think the drama triangle is often
Mm.
used just in relationships, but I think it can sketch to a vast array of life situations. Also in business, the type of people that you work with, the boss, uh, the people that you contract, or if you get contracted. This is a really interesting dynamic. I want to pull
Mm.
one important item out because, like that, we can sprinkle in more of my and your, and maybe also some of the joint healing journey. The first thing is like, it seems life is made out of patterns. So I,
Mm.
for example, was not aware about this like concept of the drama triangle, but I know that after this like first breakthrough in my trauma therapy in my early 30s, the next healing modality that I chose was a pretty intense sequence of family constellation work because I
Mm.
suddenly became aware, wait, Alistair, you've been dating around pretty intensely actually. And for whatever reason, the pattern within these relationships was always the same. So I can certainly say, even that, even, it's maybe just like adjacently connected to the topic of trauma and neurobalancing, that for me, better understanding the patterns, the programming from early childhood on in my special family constellation, the way that I chose my partners, I think most of them very unconsciously, at least in my teens and early to end 20s. So I wonder, is there a modality out of your own healing journey that you could sketch, and maybe also a couple of aha moments where you did become aware more of these like subconscious patterns on how to relate to other human beings?
Wow, there are so many aha moments. Okay, I would say one of the biggest ones on the trauma journey was when when I learned about the nervous system, right? So when I learned, the connection seems to be a bit like, are you still there? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I have, and I had a call with a person today who wanted to discover my work. And she was attracted by somewhere on my websites. I don't know where she said it, where maybe you feel like a hopeless case. And she's like, oh my God, that's me. We need to talk. I'm like, yeah, well, I feel you because I wrote this because I used to feel like that. And that's the narrative of all my clients. They've tried a lot. They've tried meditation, they've tried yoga, energy healing, talk therapy, psychoanalysis, psychedelics, maybe, you name it. All the things, and their problems still persist or keep on coming back. And I was the same. As you know, I did a lot of plant medicine without proper integration. I tried meditation, I tried yoga, all kinds of healing modalities, and everything had something to it. I did systemic therapy early in my mid-20s. Everything helped me to learn something, but the core problem still persisted. So once I learned in the intro session about the somatic experiencing practitioner training that I then did to become a trauma therapist, once I learned about the activation curve in the nervous system, this was the biggest aha moment for me to understand how my entire life has been governed by an intense activation in my nervous system. So just to quickly sketch it to you, most people know about fight flight mode, right? Essentially, we have three states in our nervous system. I call them neuro-states. Let's call them I am, I can, and I can't. I am, all these relate to our 10th cranial nerve, the vagal nerve that governs all these experiences. And the nervous system basically dictates how you feel, how you think, how you behave, and how you engage with the world. It is really your hardware. And the I am state, or the ventral vagal state, is that place when you're at rest, when you digest, when you're at ease, when you're, you know, not ecstatic, but just happy. Everything is okay. You're in connection. You can picture yourself like lying on the beach like this, or I'm in Switzerland, I'm seeing the cows there chilling, grazing. You can use that as the ventral vagal state. You can be in social connection or alone, whatever it is. The I can state is when the sympathetic nervous system activates us. We need a little bit of that, right? We need a little bit of that to give a talk, to get out into life, to do things, to have a meeting with the board, to all these type of things, to do an investor's pitch. All this stuff activates us, and we need that to have a fulfilling life. In our body, it's a release of adrenaline, of cortisol. In moderation, that is what's needed. When this activation gets too high and it doesn't regulate anymore, and we can talk later about why we don't regulate anymore and why we get stuck, that has to do with childhood again. So we are, let's say, on like the top end of the I can spectrum. So we would be constantly activated. We might be very stressed. People usually have a lot of tension in their jaw. They bite at night. You can see it. They're usually tensed. There's sometimes anger, rage, fear, sometimes even panic, a lot of thinking. This is all produced by the I can state, by the sympathetic nervous system on the top end spectrum. Now, the body at some point cannot hold this. This is intense energy, mind you. This is energy that used to be used for us in order to run away from whatever, the mammoth or the saber-toothed tiger, or whatever we had to run away from when we were still like living in the prairie. This is survival energy. This is stronger than any mantra. This is stronger than chanting Om. And this is stronger than your mind just trying to say like, oh, I'm fine, I'm not stressed. This is survival energy. I always say nervous system eats mindset for breakfast. Coming out of the, of course, culture eats strategy for breakfast. There is no way you can override the nervous system when it's in survival mode. Now, once at some point this energy is so high, we fall into this shutdown mode. The body does that to conserve energy because it's just too much. We end up in I can't or dorsal vagal shutdown state. That feels apathy. That feels like depression. That feels like burnout. That feels like you're here, but not really here. You have no more energy. We sometimes know these states. And many people, including my past self, because once you fall into this state, it's not like there's no more energy. It's all below, but it's so much that the body had to just shut it down, or we call dissociated from. But it's there. It's stored in the body. It's not gone. So at some point when you find rest, you go down the curve again and you find yourself in the intense activation again. And whoa, that's a lot. And oof, you fall into the mini burnout again. And you come out of it again. And oh, there's this activation again. And wow, I have so much power. And boom, you fall again into that depression. Or so it's this clack, 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 clack. You have energy and motivation, and you fall into, lack of energy and depression or burnout all the time. Once I saw that, I was like, oh my God, this is my life. This is my life. This explains it. That, for me, was one of the biggest aha moments about why my life has evolved that way, without any spiritual or esoteric or new age woo-woo, but simple neurobiology.
Yeah, I had to giggle so much, but I had to mute myself because what you're sketching with less of the, let's say, background of your training was also my biggest aha moment. I know we share the one of the core same, let's say, teachers, mentors, healers. And only after my breakthrough in trauma therapy, like 7 years ago, I was really, like you said, for the first time in my life, aware that I was basically always overactivated. I was very performant, best in class, doing a lot, learning languages, dating around, earning money, multiple jobs in parallel, partying hard. And I was always caught up in between, let's say, functional on the outside and then in very regular intervals collapsing on the inside.
Absolutely.
Which I think is a common pattern that our, like, let's say, late stage capitalism, whatever we want to call it, that system that tries to suck like every ounce of value add out of you, that keeps on intensifying. I wonder if we can stay on the path of how does trauma relate to dysregulated nervous system? I think we have explored that quite a bit.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
second question would be, are there other modalities than like a constantly over, let's say, over excited nervous system? And then to bring in some of the healing modalities, how can people, yeah, opt out, learn what are healing modalities that help them regulate again their nervous system? Even because I was not aware that my nervous system was basically dysregulated, maybe for the like the most part of my whole life.
So yeah, you said, like, I mean, trauma essentially is a dysregulated nervous system. If we just put it very simply, trauma is not the event, it's what happens in your body, right? So trauma is a response to an event or a prolonged series of events that was too much to cope. So everything that happens basically is a natural process. There's nothing wrong with it. And trauma is not a disease. It's not a disorder. It's a path. It's a part of life. It's a completely natural thing. And it's actually very fascinating. It's incredibly fascinating once we go away from the stigma and the pathology and the drama. So I often have clients who come to me on the discovery call, and then they give me the list of, oh, I've been diagnosed with this and that and CPTSD and anxiety disorder and panic attacks and this. And I say, okay, throw all of that out of the window. I don't want to hear any of it, because we don't need that here. So trauma is a dysregulated nervous system. In terms of the healing modalities, if I understood your question correctly, what is there to heal or to regulate the nervous system?
Yeah, let me ask more specifically. Since I know we have spent, both of us, like maybe a decade plus, up until we both had the feeling we're like functional enough to show up and share the gifts of our own healing journey in different ways, how I show up professionally and you. I wonder almost if you were to sketch like a toolbox for people, like names, techniques, modalities, but also give some of the theoretical background on what are different healing modalities and how can they actually help like different typologies of trauma.
So if I use my story, and now looking back, it's funny that because in my experience, in my story, I made a lot of mistakes on my healing journey. And my whole narrative nowadays, how I'm trying to, share my story on social media and with the stuff I do, is to help people avoid those mistakes. Basically saying, guys, girls, don't do what I did because it blew up in my face. Don't drink copious amounts of ayahuasca and thinking that will heal you, because it won't. It can, but you still have to do the work, right? So don't waste time. This woman today that I spoke to said, "Oh my God, I've spent so much money on my healing journey already, but still here I am, the same problems." So a regulated nervous system is the basis for everything. That's how I see it today. A regulated nervous system, so coming out of this intense activation, as we've discussed previously, and then finding a way to regulate again and getting the stress, that in the constant stress out of the system, and finding a place in this I am state, or at least an anchor, because you can't be there all the time. And it's okay to be stressed and it's okay to be dissociated, but at least to have a more awareness of it and be able to navigate this. And this is what my clients experienced. Like one just told me, like, it's amazing. I now navigate life like a ninja. Yes, there are still triggers. Yes, there's still stress. Yes, there's trouble, but she doesn't get blown away from it anymore. She sits there, she's facing it. Maybe she gets triggered, but she knows how to get back. And that's resilience. That's what resilience means. So when we are on a spiritual journey, like most people in our field are, a regulated nervous system is the foundation for that, in my opinion, because it allows you to inhabitate your body again, to fully come back in your body, meaning fully come back into the here and now. And from this place, I'm trying to explain it without, talking about chakras and stuff like this. From being fully grounded in your body, meaning here and present and embodied. From there, like a deeper spiritual exploration can start that can actually be an embodied experience as opposed to concepts that the mind grasps and makes some spiritual woo-woo concept out of it. And this is a problem that I see nowadays a lot in the psychedelic hype, or in the whole, whatever, Tulum, Ibiza, upper chakra spirituality areas, where people mean well. They want to heal. They want to work on themselves. So they fall into the trap of, doing ceremonies, this and that, and breath work, and all these kind of things that are now very en vogue. But it's a mental thing. And the ego is a cunning little fucker, because it takes the insights sometimes that we get, makes a concept out of it, and then, for example, wears the coat of the spiritual ego. I used to be like that. You knew me, like in my early 30s, when we still lived in Berlin. I mean, I was like the spiritual bypasser in an Olympic level. It was horrible. Because it was not embodied, it was just mental concepts. And then, of course, as you know, it blew up badly because I wasn't really healed. I wasn't in my body. There was a lot of trauma, meaning stress, in my system still. And I fell into a big depression, thinking, oh, why? I've drank 35 times ayahuasca. I think I'm enlightened, but I was not. So do it the other way around. Really do, like people would say, the shadow work and all of this. But come back into the body by fully inhabiting it, by getting the stress and everything that's in there, and from there start the spiritual journey as a real embodied experience, rather than some kind of concepts that are an illusion, essentially. That makes sense.
Yeah, I feel we're getting to the peak and the most juicy part of the podcast, because you know me as a personality, so I like to put pointers out there, and I would like to mix them with the mistakes, or maybe also the time we wasted, or the copious amounts of plant medicine we did before doing the integration work. So I'm starting, and then let's just make this juicy and funky. Sure. So my first pointer out there to anybody listening is, if you did psychedelic interventions and things don't get better, it's not necessarily, the right way to just do more psychedelic interventions, because it destabilizes your, in my own words, autopoietic system. Usually the way also, Brigitte, our joint healer, shaman, witch, teaches us, you usually do an intervention every couple of months, every 3 months, maybe twice a year. And then the hard, boring, day-to-day, weekly integration, going to your therapist, doing the integration, doing the body work, doing the exercises alone at home every day. Okay. This is the not so cool, not so funky. You're not hanging out again with vibey people in ceremonial settings, because I will also record another podcast more focusing on let's say the whole psychedelic intervention part. But I at least want to, give this a moment, because we spent a lot of time in this. And I found it very interesting that actually the really deep healing took place in a period in my life where my healer, who does this for many decades, was basically very fierce on telling me, Alistair, you've done a lot of interventions. It's a time, maybe even for a couple of years, to not do any psychedelics, be completely sober, stay just doing your exercises. And this is where, let's say, many of these high states of consciousness, often people say, we're not talking on video, so we can sketch it a little bit, but this feeling of elevation, peace, unity consciousness. But the question is always, how do you cook that down into everyday life? How do you make money, unless you're fortunate and you inherit it? How do you live your relationships? How do you navigate your everyday life? All of this is nitty-gritty day-to-day work that still may take a couple of years, but is not necessarily supported if you do just more plant medicine. So that was one point. The
Mm.
other point that I especially had to learn the hard way is also not every psychedelic compound, or in general, let's say every intervention, does the same to every person. So, for example, much like you, I did a hell lot of ayahuasca, way too many ceremonies. You said 35, I did maybe 50 or 60 before before becoming aware. Wait, Alistair, this might actually be part of you further destabilizing yourself and then stopping altogether, especially ayahuasca, for a couple of years, doing like no ceremonies at all, and then specifically working like with other compounds where I had pretty immediate effects on how they helped stabilize me. So I wonder, from all the mistakes that you did do, now we have a helicopter here, so I'm not too sure, I will cut that out. So for anybody listening, this was a helicopter flying over Alistair here in Guatemala. I wonder, what were the main mistakes that you did, and what can other clients of yours or people listening in learn from that?
So I explained before the the mechanism of the global high intensive activation. So the early on trauma where the entire system is under activation. So the people who have that walk through life and they don't know it any differently. So they would do things that way, and it's just them. They think it's their personality. Well, it's the structure of the system. So my personality would have been very, intense, a lot of things. I've done in my 30s, I've done already so many things. There was so much speed in my life because the system is under speed all the time. So obviously, with that pattern, with that mechanism, I would jump into the healing journey. So with a lot of speed going into the plant medicine world and immediately facilitating. I never facilitated myself, but like I would organize and this, and I would missionary, and one ceremony after the next, and like speed. It was the pattern at play. So the mistake was, as I said, to do way too many plant medicine ceremonies without integration. I did the classic mistake of thinking, oh, the next ceremony will solve it. Oh, I'm feeling a bit off, or oh, this is not yet healed, or this is no, I'm going to need a ceremony again. And I would grasp everyone, like sometimes weekends after weekends. And really, this is really bad. This is really bad, specifically for people with a destabilized nervous system, which there really are a lot of people like that. So in one sentence, to do too many interventions without the integration, it doesn't have to be psychedelic, can be other peak experiences, whatever experiences there are, but it needs integration afterwards. And the integration is long. It can be half a year, and it involves, just like you said, the journaling, the therapy sessions, on and on and on. I didn't do that. And yeah, blew up in my face. So I would say that's the biggest mistake. And I wish I had known earlier about the workings of the nervous system and about what trauma it really is, because it would have changed my life. I wish I could have had this in my 20s. My life has completely and utterly changed through becoming a somatic trauma therapist. Because obviously through those years of training, we go through a lot of our stuff. And I could not have fathomed how my life changes. It's the most incredible thing. Honestly, in more profound and deeper ways than with any or all my psychedelic experiences combined. I would really say that. Now, that being said, today, so I just last weekend had one of my first psychedelic experiences again in years, with a powerful Wachuma experience with a shaman that is a friend. And the way I experience this now, and the way I can integrate it, and the insights and the change that comes from this now is so different. It is a completely different thing, because I can enter this realm difficulty, and I also I'm able to navigate the transformation and the integration completely differently. So that my mother, for example, said when I called her yesterday as I came back, she said, well, this shaman of yours that you're seeing, don't get what you're doing there, but it seems to be doing you good. Stick to him. And that's beautiful. That shows immediately that now something has changed, that I can go to such an experience with a regulated nervous system, with a presence, and with an ability to navigate these altered states of consciousness completely different as opposed before, when you have, let's say, an activated nervous system and you pour something like that on it. Let's say you take and do an LSD ceremony or MDMA, whatever, it can be like, it deactivates even more or destabilizes even more. So that is, I would say, the biggest mistake I've made. No integration and no nervous system work. Yep, that's it.
Yeah, I want to put another pointer out there and maybe coin it positively. When I started my journey, pretty much in the year 2011, so 12 years ago, there was way less information and trained and educated support out there. So the first pointer is, don't do too many interventions of whatever sort, be they with psychedelic compounds or others like rebirthing, breath work, or stuff like that. The second pointer, where I also, truth be told, although I read quite a bit about it, I was not really doing the deep research. So there's large databases out there. The best one that I know internationally is like Third Wave, where you can really like dive very deep into the case studies of the different, let's say, just compounds out there. So LSD is LSD. It's not the same as mushrooms. Mushrooms are mushrooms. Ayahuasca is ayahuasca. Wachuma that you mentioned is like the San Pedro cactus, which I think is pretty similar to peyote because the psychedelic compound is mescaline. And then there's
different amino acids, though.
And then there's like ketamine and other stuff that I also did not try. So I think the 2 pointers for those listening in, it's like, first of all, educate yourself. Secondly, the real work is the integration. The medicine won't just do it for yourself. You might have a very breakthrough moment, like a peak experience of this feeling, wow, suddenly I understood and we're cutting through something that was really falling on my feet for my whole life. But the nitty-gritty work needs to be done either alone and or with a joint therapist, companion, shaman, healer, which whatever we wanna call it.
Yeah. I'd like to say something there, as you say, about the psychedelic world, because we're in a time where it's very fancy, it's very cool to do psychedelic stuff. And unfortunately, and I'm going to say this in a bit of a polemic way, purposefully, but there are a lot of dudes and girls who maybe in Bali or Tulum had a mushroom experience, and then they feel themselves to be called to become a shaman because they had some kind of ayahuasca supposedly told them that they are the reincarnation of Cleopatra or Alexander the Great or something like that. And they become a shaman and they facilitate ceremonies. Now that is very difficult because as a guide, as a facilitator, I like to say you can only guide people as far as you've gone yourself. And even though there is a hype and everybody nowadays is taking mushroom at parties, it's still, first of all, a sacred medicine, but secondly, things can go sideways. I just want to mention a few words like psychedelic narcissism, ego inflation, and psychosis. That shit happens, and it happens a lot. So if people are interested and curious of doing this type of work or feel called to it, I think it's of the essence to find somebody and to work with somebody who really has experience. And this does not have to be an MD or a PhD, because nowadays these people are being trained in some kind of courses, but they haven't done numerous journeys themselves. And I always say to people, look, if you had brain surgery, would you rather be with somebody who has all the titles and all the certifications and Harvard and Stanford and all the things, and has maybe done twice brain surgery? Or would you rather be with somebody who might be from not a fancy university, but who has done like 350 brain surgeries successfully? I'd rather choose the person with experience. you don't want to trust your life or your mental life, your spiritual life to somebody who's like, I think this is very important. And I'm saying this because nowadays there are a lot of people who feel called to that, and it's good, but take it with, take it serious, take it with integrity. And I have unfortunately so often heard stories from things that just have not gone well. Shamans who did, sexually abuse women in their circle, who did not, consciously or unconsciously, who were not aware of the power dynamic between the healer or the therapist and the client. And that leads to further re-traumatization. Which brings us back to what we said in the beginning, because often it is these women who suffered sexual abuse. They go to an ayahuasca ceremony to heal, and lo and behold, they sit with a shaman who tells them, look, in order to heal your sexual trauma, we're going to have sex. No. So it's a slippery slope.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. I can only underline that. So a couple of pointers. Educate yourself on what intervention. It's not all the same interventions. Not all psychedelic compounds are the same. It's all about the integration work, and choose your guides wisely. Due diligence, much you would like. I really like your example with the brain surgery, or really like intensive care, because an ayahuasca ceremony goes to the very core of the essence. It completely shatters your nervous system. It can be one of the most liberating and fruitful experience, but you're also like risking something. It's really like going to a hospital to like open your body and have somebody, put a knife into your body, and you need the right anesthetics for that. And after that, being still in the hospital and proper care and maybe antibiotics or whatever you need to really properly heal. I really like that. And I think I'm good with the pointers towards the end of the podcast. So we're never doing this as like propagating yourself and please book Johannes Eisenburger. It's not about that. But what I wonder from all these mistakes and all their own healing, can you sketch a couple of examples without mentioning names from your own work? And like, how do you combine these various modalities and techniques into this approach of what you call neuro-balancing? Because I know you're consciously in your going to market strategy, not talk about trauma, because trauma is still like, in one sense, a buzzword, but also some people don't want to hear about it. Yeah, so please sketch me some of your work with clients, and how do you do your work of neuro-balancing?
So why don't I talk about trauma? I mean, I do, because I set out with this intense excitement and the life-changing experience that I've had. I went out into the world and said, I am here on a mission to make trauma healing popular. And then a wonderful ex-client of mine, and hello at this point, if you're listening, you know who you are. At some point called me up and said, listen, I try to recommend your work to so many people, but whenever I mention the word trauma, people back off and they think something's wrong. And they ask me, why did I have to go to the trauma therapist? And poor me, am I all right? And then I have to explain everything that I know from you now, but like, is there no other way you can call your work? And I said, oh my God, you are so right. I didn't get it, because I know what trauma really is. And I've had, I'm fascinated by it. And I know how wonderfully it changed my life, and my clients do, but only after they've gone through the process. So in that moment, I, by the way, realized I made this whole mission about myself instead of how I can be of service. So in that moment, it became to me clearly like I need to come off a bit like as a Trojan horse, right? I need to be a bit careful with the wording, but still be 100% solid with what I deliver. And then I just channeled this name neuro-balancing, because it's what it is. Neuro, the nervous system, balancing, to put it back into balance out of dysregulation. And essentially, trauma is like stress. So I talk more about stress because trauma is like stress in the system, and stress is the root cause. So that's the backstory to that. And let me share a few examples. Let's see what comes up. So for example, I want to use a few different ones. So for example, a very physical one. There was this woman who was recommended to me, in fact, by her daughter that was also my client. And she was suffering from an autoimmune disease called polymyalgia rheumatica. Yeah, an autoimmune disease where the ends of the nerves are inflamed. And you can find this on my Instagram as one of the client success stories. This woman was suffering for years and basically said, my whole body's in pain. It feels like frozen. And she couldn't do anything anymore. She was living on cortisone. She couldn't do anything anymore. She tried everything. Conventional doctors, homeopath, everything. So she said, why don't we give this a try? I said, okay, let's play. We worked together for a couple of weeks because I found out that this thing started with a traumatic event within their family. And one thing caught my attention is when she said, my body feels like frozen. So this is what we started exploring. After a couple of weeks, this woman was off cortisone, no more pain, is doing yoga again every day, and has her life back. And I saw her again just recently in summer at their home, because they're family friends. And I said, how are you doing? She said, wonderful. This just has never come back. So this is because autoimmune diseases are a trauma response very, very often. So this is one wonderful example of physical healing. And the same goes for migraines. The same goes for long COVID. The same goes for post-vaccine. The same goes for irritable bowel disease, asthma. All these are syndromatic, as we call it, syndromatic responses to unresolved trauma. And then on the level of more, let's say, personal, mental, I have a client and I've been working with her for years. She's an executive. And her issue was, to think back how it was, because we've been working together for some time. Essentially, she was triggered easily. Working in a high pressure financial world, very successful, but triggered very easily. A woman in a still male dominated world, she had to kind of, be tough, but that was an act. And she would often burst out screaming in the office or secretly cry in the toilet, constantly activated, basically an emotional roller coaster all the time. So we've been working with neuro-balancing, right? So this is a mix between executive coaching and neuro-balancing, which is the unique selling proposition that I have, right? So that's like life coaching, executive coaching, plus somatic tools and trauma therapy. And over the course of time, up until now, it's amazing. She just said, look, this is the woman where I said, like, I'm navigating life like a ninja. She's calm, she's centered, she is way more able to navigate, because the business is still as stressful. And it's a high-pitched, high-pressure environment with a lot of money at stake and all this stuff. But she's so much more calmer. And she doesn't have these confrontations in the office anymore where she, felt pressured when the chairman of the board was calling her out in front of the whole board, for example, and losing, as we would say, losing her shit, or just losing her groundedness, or feeling attacked. But no, she's there, she's centered, she's grounded, she can bring her point across. And she also said, like, this is a direct correlation to her bottom line and to her success, which is amazing, and to her quality of life. Because before, which was a boundary topic, professional life and private life was just like a merged thing. And now she can actually have a life, which creates a whole experience, and also the professional experience makes it way more fulfilling, because it's not just this constant hamster wheel of stress, but it's like, oh yeah, there's stress, and sometimes it's tough, and sometimes, yeah, I fall off the wheel, but I know how to get back on it within the next day latest. And I can also enjoy my life. I can be present when I'm with my friends. I can shut off. I can sleep. So this is a wonderful example as well. And wow, there are so many. Let me maybe use another example. A woman that came to me because she felt lost in life, right? I mean, she had everything you would want to have, but she was lost in the multitude of things that one can do. She couldn't decide. Her energy level was up, a lot of motivation. She would start new things. She would start like a new, whatever, I'm becoming this now, I'm going to do that now, I'm starting this business, oh, I'm going to train in becoming this and that. And then she would crash and feel sad and slightly depressed. And so you see that wave that we've discussed earlier. And she was very influenced by the opinion of the family or of societal pressures, and she couldn't really she lost herself in that thing. Over the course of time with us working together, we have found out, or we have sort of, let's say, rediscovered a sexual abuse story, which I get to see in my practice a lot. There is a lot of sexual abuse out there. Oh my God. Often completely dissociated. Often people just forget about it. Men and women, by the way. So we could integrate this into our work. And what I like to share about this story is that she said, I was so scared to bring this up because I didn't want to talk about this anymore. But the funny thing is, or the exciting thing was that we didn't really have to talk about it. Because why? We work in the here and now. So it's not like with the psychotherapist where you sit and you talk for days about the past and ruminate in the past. It doesn't even matter. The story doesn't even matter. It's about what is left in the body as stress and as coping mechanisms today, here and now, and how do we release that? So once we did that, and then we combine it with some coaching on integration and all that, she today has one successful business that she's actually working on sustainably, not just starting it and throwing it away again. A relationship that's working. My latest news is that she's actually pregnant. So life has completely turned around. It's amazing. It's amazing how what has happened. Nothing in the external world has changed. Everything in the inner world has changed. So it's an inside-out experience. So these are kind of three different cases where this neuro-balancing approach, the somatic work, has changed everything for people who've tried a lot already. Yeah.
I find very interesting. Now we have a lot of birds in the background. Also, I won't cut them out. I'm sitting in the middle of the rainforest in Guatemala. So I feel it feels like it's been a very rich podcast, and I feel like finishing it with a couple of positive pointers, and I'm happy to start. So first of all, healing is never finished because we're living in a complex world, and basically life is unpredictable. But I can certainly say that Alistair, as speaking of now, age 44, has healed and integrated to a point that is beyond any imagination that I could have ever felt or imagined 10 years ago. So the first pointer out there is healing is possible. And I think both of us, we felt like these hopeless cases and going to therapists and trying all and everything out. So the first pointer is it's possible. The second one is do the due diligence, better longer than less. Do the research. What do you think really helps you? So I wondered to give like a positive example. And besides talking about your clients, what is your sense of the everyday life, so that we ended like in this like now moment? How is your overactivation, that has been haunting you, much like myself for so many years? How is that feeling in everyday life? And then maybe, just end the podcast with some pointers. And then when we hang up, we can build some show notes and some references where people can really start doing some research on their own.
Yeah. My everyday life. So as I said, my pattern is this overactivation, and then my life gets very fast. This is a part of me, this comes in every now and then. So this does happen, but I'm aware of it when it happens, and it's not like I spend 5 years on it and then I wake up again. It's still like, oh, I'm in this thing again, and I know what to do to get out of it. The tangible changes in my life is, I used to be incapable of chilling, for example. I could not just rest and sit somewhere and just be happy with where I am, who I am right now, or just sit in a cafe and read the news or a book or whatever, or just be alone. I wasn't capable of that. I was constantly doing something, constantly striving, achieving, running, traveling, partying, whatever. So the most beautiful change for my personal life is that I'm able to be in the here and now and feel deeply connected to myself, to my surroundings, to the spiritual realm as well, to nature. And when it relates to, let's say, business or my daily work, for example, I wasn't able to take breaks. I would just constantly exhaust myself to the breaking point. And just now I have a feeling, again, I'm connected to my body, and I know when there's energy and the impulse to create and work and do, and that comes out of myself. And then I feel when it's time for a break, and I rest guilt-free, because I was haunted by guilt for not doing, for not achieving, for not performing. And now I can perform and do and achieve, and I can rest guilt-free and recover, and then come back into performing and doing and creating. It almost makes me cry when I hear myself say that, because it's just such a different quality of life. It's incredible.
Yeah. Thanks for that very like warm, intensive, very intimate podcast. I really feel like the word balance maybe is almost like the last word I'm saying, because if you as a listener constantly have the feeling you're out of balance, life overwhelms you, and you find that precious place where you subjectively have the feeling you're in balance with all the challenges of life, then maybe truly you have found healing. And I want to end this really, I don't know if it's a prayer, but I truly wish for those listening into this specific episode, wherever you are in your healing journey, that you trust that healing is possible, and that you find the right guides and companions along your way. So thanks so much, Johannes, for this beautiful episode.
Thank you. My pleasure.